It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Friedman Speaker Series this year. This is the first Speaker Series speaker. It's very special because it's the Stanley and Gershoff Memorial Lecture. For those of you who don't know who Stanley N. Gershoff was, he was the founding dean of the Friedman School, and he really had a very expansive vision of what nutrition should be, and I think the school has really grown and reflected that. Right now, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Sievenpiper, um, who I first became aware of his work when I was part of the Evidence Practice Center at Tufts University before it moved to Brown. And John has just really, he's a luminary in the field. It sort of appears that when you do, you read a systematic review, it may have a meta-analysis, you should just assume that that's the last word in things, but that's not always the case because it depends on how it's done. But it's particularly important. Evidence reviews are incredibly important and more important than they were about 20 years ago, because whereas 20 years ago for things like the Dietary Guidelines Committee, American Heart Association, they came out with guidelines, you looked at the primary research. But it's just too voluminous, the support's not there, so the committees are told to rely on evidence reviews. But you have to make, but without really understanding what the complexities are of evidence reviews in the field of nutrition, you can really be thrown off. John has an incredibly impressive CV. He comes to us from the University of Toronto. He has many positions there. The major ones are as professor in the Department of Nutrition Science and Medicine, a staff physician in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism, and the lead of the Toronto D2 Knowledge Synthesis and Clinical Trials Unit. His expertise is very well known, and he has many, many awards and recognitions of the incredible contributions that he has made. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sievenpiper, and who's a true star in the field. And the title of his presentation is Evidence Synthesis of Nutrition Research, Pitfalls and Opportunities.
Well, thank you very much for this incredible honor. It's truly a pleasure to be here in Boston with you to deliver this memorial lecture. I did have some interaction, never directly with Stanley Gershoff, in that when I was an undergraduate, I used to always look at the Tufts Nutrition and Health Letter. That was a secondary research, not original or primary research we'll talk a bit about today, but it was sort of one of my first exposures to nutrition, and a very important one and formative one for me. So it's an honor to be able to give this lecture in his name and to be able to join you here at Tufts. I think this is an important topic. A lot of you may be doing this as part of a chapter, as part of your PhD theses. A lot of medical students will do it when they do rotations with us, because it's something they can continue. They don't have to come back for lab work, because often it will go beyond the 1 or 2 months they're with us. And very important for informing guidelines, clinical practice guidelines, but also public health policy related guidelines. So I think it's worth understanding, a lot of the issues. And so what I hope to do is just, take you through. I always have too many slides, but I like to have a lot of examples just to sort of stimulate discussion. So just think of it. We'll move quickly through a lot of them, just so I hope we can touch on things that will appeal to you. But just to say, a lot of this has come out of, and a lot of the examples out of my own personal frustrations as both a clinician and being able to translate research at the bedside and be able to discuss these things with my patients and translate the knowledge syntheses that have been done or systematic reviews, meta-analyses, but also as a guidelines maker, the frustration with some of the existing systematic reviews and meta-analyses when we aren't able to commission them and we have to rely on the literature, how we can actually use that information to inform our guidelines process. So that's where a lot of this work and these examples come from. So I was trained by David Jenkins, so I put everything on my disclosure slide. So intellectual, so a lot of guidelines work I've done, which is up there on the left. Also research support, both from agency and statutory funding, but also where it's been from some industry. We do a lot of trials, so we do get in-kind food donations for our trials. And some honorary and speaker fees. I foresee any real conflicts with this talk because a lot of it's just examples, and really this is a sort of a health research methods talk more than anything with some examples. So let's kick off. Well, meta-analyses represent one of the fastest growing publication types. So if you look over, which would be on your left, you're going to see all publications from 1995 to 2015. And when you look at the slopes of those curves compared to what you see there for meta-analyses or systematic review publications, and these are just filters in PubMed that you may have seen, what you can see is that the slopes are much more dramatic for the meta-analyses systematic reviews. And in particular, you can see that there's some shift, and the majority now, and this has been true for the last several years, are coming out of China. So they are absolutely ahead in terms of pushing these. And a lot of these, there's been some criticism, maybe automated. I mean, I have to see, I've seen a number on topics that I've done, and I swear we wrote the abstract. Like it's almost was pre-chat GPT, so I guess they just basically took everything word for word, and then just put in their own analyses. So there's an automated component, I think, to some of those. But you can just, this is just to impress you with the number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses you see. Part of the issue with that, and John Ioannidis has written on this and others, is this issue of replication, duplication, and waste. And so they, based on their sort of metadata approach, they have suggested that there's probably over 250,000, and this was back in 2018 when they wrote this, systematic reviews, meta-analyses. And this issue that you're getting a lot of overlap and redundancy, a lot of duplication, and it leads to some mixed results, which is sort of leaves the guidelines makers or you as knowledge users or trying to get an answer for designing a study. Well, what are the issues here? And you might ask, well, is this an issue for nutrition? I just did this for this talk. If you just do the systematic review meta-analysis filters in PubMed, there's over 18,000. And you do have a lot of duplication on the same question, which can give you different answers. So one of the questions I often get, and you may be asking, is why do meta-analyses on the same question come to different conclusions? Pretty similar entry criteria. It should be the same data, similar methods, yet coming to what can seem like vastly different conclusions. And I just want to give you a few examples just to kind of, just get you the appetite going for some of the examples we're going to go through and not make the talk too dry. So I'll give you one here. This contradicts, so that with the WHO, so going from, almost 10 years, this question of saturated fat. So in 2015, a good colleague and friend, Russ D'Souza at McMaster, he's someone actually I did my undergrad with, and we TA'd stats together. And he's a McMaster now, so it goes way back, and he's a very good researcher. He did this WHO Commission systematic review, and their conclusion, because they were looking really at a lot of, we'll talk a bit about that, prevalent or baseline exposures to saturated fat, not looking at substitutions, not looking at change, they had to conclude that based on the totality of the evidence, the epidemiological evidence, that there wasn't a robust association. Now, in fairness to Russ, and he knew he was going to get a lot of flack for this, they put a lot in the discussion about substitution analyses and really, I think looking at the counterfactuals in terms of what the substitution saturated fat, because when you substitute polyunsaturated for saturated, and Alice has done a lot of work on this, then you do see reductions in events, but they didn't have the data to do the meta-analysis. Well, it took 8 years, and it just came out, it says 2022, but it just came out in February. The WHO updated their systematic review and meta-analysis, and they did look at the substitutions. We now had enough available data, and now they've made a convincing argument for their saturated fat and trans fat. We certainly had the signal for trans fat, but saturated fat being a source of harm, and that replacing it with PUFA, plant MUFA, or slowly digested carbohydrates can have advantages. So that's one example. Another one, and you may have heard this got a lot of attention, the meat papers and Annals of Internal Medicine, this series. It was based on 5 systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and then there was a guideline paper that came with it. It was a series of 6 papers. I was actually involved as a disclosure in one of the papers, the Vernoij paper. one of the systematic reviews meta-analyses is a content expert, and what the interesting thing there was all the systematic reviews meta-analyses came to the same conclusion. They were well done as every other systematic review meta-analysis that's been done, showing this adverse association with red meat and processed meat, diabetes, cardiovascular mortality, MI incidence, stroke mortality, all-cause mortality. So showing, these really big patient-important, public health important outcomes, showing these adverse associations with high versus low intake, with dose response. Yet, because the evidence was determined to be based on their assessment, a very low or low certainty, this became a values and preferences sensitive question, and they used the values and preferences research, which was that middle paper, and I made it bigger because it sort of trumped the others to suggest that most people wouldn't want to make a change. And so you should continue current unprocessed and red meat consumption. And processed. So this was the conclusion there. And that goes against like World Cancer Research Fund, AHA, like any guideline, like this is really was the only guideline where every other guideline had said something different. So there's another example. Another one is around, it's become particularly controversial. WHO came out with their guideline in May, and then there was IARC looking at safety of aspartame. So sweeteners have been in the media a lot. This is another question where you see conflicting systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So here you look at all the major sort of diabetes, obesity, and heart guidelines. Alice was involved, I know, with the American Heart statement there, and they all have suggested that insofar as you're replacing sugar-sweetened beverages, where again, this is a cost, a benefit-harm question, there is a benefit of low and no-calorie sweeteners to displace added and free sugars from sugar-sweetened beverages and the calories from that. And this is a universal. And the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee 2020, they updated the position because there was now sufficient evidence to suggest that beverages, low and no calories in beverages, may be useful aid in weight management in adults. But the WHO came out with they did a couple of commissioned reviews, and their conclusion was they're not to be used. Something there to point out, which we'll get to, is you'll notice there, interestingly, they're the only guideline or recommendation that doesn't have a comparator in it. So they're just saying used, period, not in substitution for what? Everything in nutrition is a substitution. So all the other guidelines talk about it in terms of a replacement strategy for sugars and calories from sugars. WHO just talked about it, in isolation, which may be part of why they came to the conclusion they did, but in stark opposition to really all of the major guidelines on this topic. So there's a few examples. There are many others. Those are just a few that that have come across my screen and I've identified as an issue, and we'll revisit some of them in terms of some of the examples. So what are the issues? So I thought I would run through 10. You could make this list longer. I'll try to give some examples. So, we're not going to be here till tomorrow, but what I wanted to do is, I think, give you some of the main ones. And there are many, many others as it relates to the conduct of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but these are the 10 that I've sort of identified. So lack of perspective on study design, lack of pre-registration of protocols, serious risk of bias, poor methods for pooling data or poor reporting of methods for pooling data, serious inconsistency between study estimates, which we call heterogeneity, serious imprecision in pooled estimates, poor modeling of dose-response relationships, serious indirectness, so this is getting at the nature of the intervention or the exposure. Food is pretty complex, and when you reduce it down to nutrients, they behave differently than maybe a full food matrix, like a whole food or a food source. So one of the examples we look at, serious indirectness that relates to the comparator, because everything we do as a food choice is usually one for another. So the importance of the swap, of the substitution, and then serious publication bias. So I've just got some examples for each one. We won't be here till tomorrow. I'm going to try to make it interesting and really show the examples. So in terms of perspective on study design, this is a hierarchy of evidence that is pretty much universal across systems of evidence-based medicine. I've put a few there. But in general, this is what you're going to see. We've done it a bit differently, and others do the same thing. We've ripped the top off the pyramid, because often you put systematic reviews and analyses at the top, but really systematic reviews and analyses are our best way of pooling the data. What we're really talking about is the units of analysis, which are the study units. So that is where we get, that's the crap in, crap out sort of phenomena. So we have to think, when we thinking about perspective and study design, it's really what are the units of analysis. So for the units of analysis, we have randomized trials at the top. This, you could argue, and others have, this is kind of comes out of a drug model where we have large randomized trials of important clinical events like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, death, and cancer. We don't have those in nutrition. We tend to have randomized trials of intermediate biomarkers. We do have some large clinical outcomes trials like the PrediMed. There are a few others, Look Ahead, where we have those big patient important, public health important outcomes. But part of the issue with this pyramid is those are intermediate biomarkers. To really get at those big outcomes, we need to look at our best designed observational studies, which are prospective cohort studies. So you'll see different pyramids where people redraw and say these should be higher and the RCT should be below. But really it's about both and agreement. And I think the study designs still hold, but it's a matter of the evidence we have for the question. In nutrition, we do rely a lot on epi. But there is a place for randomized trials and intermediate biomarkers. And we have those large clinical outcomes trials. Those are great. But just recognizing those RCTs are really intermediate biomarkers to get those big important outcomes with a long longitudinal follow-up. We need prospective cohorts, and those give us the best design to look at that. The randomized trials are there rightly, though. I mean, they do allow for the random distribution of prognostic factors. That's why they are there. We can't do that with prospective cohorts. We do adjustments. So there's always this issue of residual confounding, but then there's trade-offs with the outcomes we look at. So just to bear that in mind. And different systems of evidence-based medicine have ways of upgrading and downgrading so that you can get a better sense of the certainty of the literature. This is an example, and Denny Beer gave me this when I was on the editorial board at AJCN with them, and I thought it was a great one. It was just to show you what you can get, and this is just a medical example with digoxin, looking at mortality, but you can see, what we saw with the observational studies showing quite a large risk ratio, hazard ratio for harm, but then when you did some adjusted values, when you did propensity scoring, it was able to kind of regress. And it wasn't until you did big randomized trials that you actually see that there's no mortality signal. But just to show you, and there are lots of examples in nutrition around antioxidants, for example. The epidemiology clearly showed that fruit and vegetable intake associated with lower cancer. Looking more reductionist, we thought, okay, beta carotene might be a good idea. We had the ATBC, the carrot trials; those ended up having more cancer, killing more people. So there's examples in nutrition too, where where randomized trials really were important in clarifying some of these signals. But lots of examples too where they're confirmed. So not to say, and I would say more signals where they're confirmed than necessarily against, but we have to be mindful of that confounding. So a paper I was pleased to be with, and she was on a committee with Alice and I and Frank at ASN, where we're talking about interpretation of research and guidelines, is Dana Zaratkar. She's a new faculty at McMaster, and she did this systematic review of nutritional epidemiology. And one thing she noted was only about 10%, very low reviews used an established system to evaluate the certainty of evidence. So Alice talked about a lot of people, their interpretation of systematic reviews is the diamond. It's is it showing benefits, showing harm, or is it null? And that's it. And I'm going to take that conclusion. I'm going to write my position. We really need to subject it, though, to assessment of certainty of evidence. And there are different ways of doing that. The one that now has got the biggest literature and is supported by the most organizations, and there's a lot of criticisms, I think, well placed against it, but I think there are lots of ways we can adapt it and work with it, and that's what we've done with our nutrition guidelines, is grade. This is the first 15 papers in the series. I don't think it's up to 38. So it's very well published in terms of the actual being able to use it. They actually have their handbook online too. So it's got a lot of resources to support it. It's something I was trained in for the European guidelines and our Canadian cardiovascular study guidelines. It takes the evidence pyramid that I showed you, and it starts RCTs off at high and observation studies start as low. But there are a number of downgrades and upgrades, some of which we'll be talking about today, like inconsistency and imprecision and so on, that can be applied so that RCTs will often fall down in terms of their evidence level, and observation studies can come up. You can think of something like smoking, very large magnitude of effect, good dose response, very well designed observational studies. That would be high certainty of evidence coming from observational studies. So there are ways to work with that. This is the grade system as one, but there are others. There's NutriGrade. It's actually not part of the grade, though, just wasn't sanctioned by grade. Louis Schwingshackle, who did that, actually is at the grade center, and he's with the grade group and Cochrane groups, but he developed this as a way to better reconcile some of these issues with the nutritional epidemiology. The HELM, which David Katz and Walter Willett and others put together, and Mei Chung, I think, who was in this room, was part of that too. We're part of doing that. And then there's sort of the old standby, the Sir Austin Bradford Hill criteria for causality. There's also the World Cancer Research Fund. There's a lot of different ones you can use, but the point is really that you need to subject the data in a systematic review, it's not a black box, not just the diamond, to really an assessment of certainty of evidence. And we'll talk a bit about that. Lack of pre-registration of protocols. So it's part of PRISMA. It's changed a bit where it appears in the PRISMA statement, but it is a requirement that protocols be registered as we do for clinical trials. If we look at our nutrition journals, the flagship being American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, there is a suggestion. I know Denny Beer, when he was editor-in-chief, wanted to make it a requirement, but there's not enough people doing it, and it may limit even retrospective sort of requirement. But it's something where I think it is the standard. It's something we do. I know Mei Chung and others that are working in this area do this. But it's something we have to think of. There's a lot of registries where you can do that. Prospero is the main one, but clinicaltrials.gov, you can do it, and also a number of others. Pre-registration is an issue. About 20%, only 20, like less than a quarter, only 20%, 1/5 of systematic reviews actually reported registration of protocols. So it's something I think we could do better at. And this is just to give you an example, because on clinicaltrials.gov, you can register them as an observational study. It just shows you the big difference in terms of registrations, RCTs versus observational studies, which would include also systematic risk analyses, much, much lower. Serious risk of bias. So really being able to assess the risk of bias is important. And this is just to give you a couple of examples. And this is one, and you may not really realize like where some of our sugars guidelines come from. So there's a weak or conditional recommendation from the WHO for less than 5%. They're one of the only organizations that have a 5%. And part of the reason might be the evidence. The evidence where this came from actually was from 3 ecological studies in Japan pre and during World War II, where the population, because of war, had lower sugar intake. So a lot of sources of risk of bias and indirectness here. They were looking at ecological per capita intake data, not on the individual, like through a survey or others. There was no real adjustment for confounders. It was Japanese children before and during World War II, so you have this duress of war, no fluoridation, no fluoride toothpaste, no modern dental hygienic techniques, and no real adjustment for even that at the time. So very hard to draw conclusions, and it was downgraded quite rightly to for serious risk of bias. It was considered using the grade, which is a WHO approach, very low certainty evidence. So that conditional recommendation, this was the basis for this Paula Moynihan commissioned review, and this was the 5%. The 10% where the dental caries was definitely based on stronger evidence as it relates to dental caries. Looking at another example, this is it relates to body weight. So this was the 10% now, where the body weight informed that the most. This was another commissioned review, this by Elise Timaranga and Jim Mann, the BMJ. And here they downgraded, here's the risk of bias tool from the Cochrane, the original one, for incomplete outcome data, and they downgraded the evidence. This is just to show you the importance to really look at, this is looking at the quality of the individual studies, not the overall certainty, where this is one component of looking at certainty of the body of evidence, where you need to look at those units of analysis, look at the studies. Poor methods for pooling data. So you're confronted with a couple, I don't want to make this Mei Chung might like this to get really into the stats and the math, but I don't want to make this like get right into it. But just to say there are 2 main models. I mean, we can get into network and Bayesian, but really the 2 main, and even our survey, like our systematic review, these really are the only with dose response analysis, the 2 main approaches we have. We have fixed effects and random effects. Investigators need to decide a priori whether they're going to use it. And the random effects model takes into account heterogeneity with tau squared. You can see that in the denominator there on the right. It doesn't in fixed effects. They actually both give you the same answer when tau is very low, when it approaches 0, when there's no heterogeneity. But you have to ask the question, there's a lot of debates. So Richard Pito, the famous epidemiologist, would argue there's no time you should use a random effects model, only fixed effects. But he's using big databases where the little studies can have, I'll show you a worked example, can get more weight in the analysis, and it takes away from the larger studies with better estimates. But in nutrition, we don't feed 99% pure drugs. We're not asking people to swallow pills. We're asking them to consume food within a cultural framework. And it can be very different what we do in Toronto that you do in Boston, although we're probably very similar culturally, but certainly very different than maybe what's done in Mumbai or done in Beijing or done somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can imagine, or in Australia, New Zealand, where these trials are being done, that there isn't going to be one fixed true effect. There's going to be a distribution of effects, and that's what the random effects model assumes. There's a distribution of true effects, and that those would be because of differences in matrix and culture and just the way the intervention is delivered, even the way the comparator, all those things might be slightly different even though you're looking at the same thing. A plant-based diet, for example, may be very different in those places. So you would expect that you would get a distribution of effects. So that's kind of what the random effects model assumes, and it uses Tuskegee. And you need to, if you have that sort of discussion with yourself and your team, a priori, you should make the decision whether you're going to use a random or fixed effects. And that's the approach that we take. We usually use random effects for the arguments I just gave, but tau is very hard, or it's difficult to calculate when you have less than 5 studies. So oftentimes when we have a very small number of studies, we will use we'll default to a fixed effects, but we specify that a priori. Unfortunately, almost a third, certainly a quarter of investigators actually make their decision post hoc. So they select the meta-analytical technique based on the heterogeneity. So if I got heterogeneity, I'm going to use the fixed effects. Sorry, the random effects. If I don't, I'm going to use the fixed effects. The point is you need to make that decision up front. Your statistical plan has to be clear, and that's not always the case, surprisingly. This is just to show you an example of fixed versus random. This is a work example actually I did with Russ D'Souza for one of our courses, and it just shows you here. What it does is it gives more weight to smaller studies and proportionally less weight to larger studies. And so the criticism is you're taking away from those larger studies. What it's really getting at is that distribution of effects, but you need to have that discussion as to what is going to be the most appropriate model. But just know that that's the case. But when there's no heterogeneity, both give identical answer, the same answer, because tau goes to 0. And at low levels of heterogeneity, the performance is very, very similar. This is just to give you an example where I was involved at the second point. So Vasanti Malik, who was at Harvard with Frank Hu and now is on faculty with us at the University of Toronto, did the 2013 review. Their a priori model was a random effects model, but they also looked at fixed. The top diamond on the left is the random, the bottom is the fixed. Didn't see it with the random effects model, did with the fixed. This is looking at reduction of sugar-sweetened beverages in kids using water or low-calorie sweeteners. We updated that meta-analysis 10 years later. We now have 3 new RCTs. Both models show the benefit of displacing or replacing those sugar-sweetened beverages, low-calorie beverages, or water. But just to show you, that the 2 models can give you different answers, and this is just how to show you a shift. This is another one, a worked example as it relates to glycemic index and load. This is getting now at in terms of pooling data, what data do you select? So this is a work that Jeff Livesey did, and we did as it relates to glycemic index and load, and looking at correlation coefficients. So looking at truly valid dietary instruments for what you're looking at. In this case, for carbohydrate, they had to have a correlation coefficient greater than 0.55. And you can see because you get more misclassification bias at the lower level, you get more random error, you tend to see smaller, the effects tend to kind of, if you like, regress to the null. You can see here with less than 0.55, you get smaller associations. If you look at those with greater than 0.55, you get stronger, larger effect estimates or association estimates, and some better precision, just to show you that example. Another one that we came across is, and these are both epidemiological examples, is what exposure assessment do you use? So oftentimes, a lot of prospective cohort studies will give you, all they've done is they've just done an FFQ at the beginning. So you have what we call prevalent exposure, baseline exposure. And then they followed them for 20 or 30 years and looked at cardiovascular disease, death, diabetes, cancer. Well, diet can change over that. I mean, the arguments can be made that it's stable and we can still use that. But when you look at this methods paper, this relates to body weight, which is an interesting one. They looked at 3 ways of modeling exposure. So prevalent, change for change or change, and lag change. This, of course, is where you have something like the Harvard cohorts where you have serial repeated measures. Not every cohort gives you that, so you are limited. But just to say that it gives you different measures. And what they found was you got more robust, consistent, biologically plausible estimates. Something certainly agreed better with the RCTs, made more sense as relates to weight when you looked at change. Yes, when you looked at change for change. So a better way to model the exposure. Well, this was relevant because this was a systematic meta-analysis published in the CMAJ. Megan Azad, Dylan McKay, actually good researchers, and they did generally a good job with the methodology. But we had criticized it for a number of reasons, but one of them was their assessment of reverse causality. But we found, we dug into it, is actually the paper they selected actually was that Smith paper, which was a methodology paper, where the conclusion was you should use change data. But they actually modeled prevalent data, and you see here what we see a lot with the low-calorie sweetened beverage literature, which is reverse causality. Those consuming it are doing it as a weight loss approach or approach to mitigate risk. They're at high risk themselves, so you see a higher signal, not because of the low no-calorie sweetened beverages, but rather because they're at risk, they're consuming them. And what you can see here is when you look at, if you do baseline prevalent, you see increased risk. I did the exact same analysis plan they had done, and I did it, and now you see a reduction. So same data, same cohorts, just using prevalent versus change, giving you a very different answer. So it's just something to be aware of. Serious inconsistency. So this is an issue with inconsistency across study estimates. We measure this as heterogeneity. Different organizations will set their bar differently. So SACN, for heterogeneity to be high, it's got to be 75% or higher. For WHO, it was 60%. Heterogeneity goes from 0 to 100%, just so you know. Would be considered substantial heterogeneity and it has to be significant. Our diabetes nutrition study group, we were more conservative. We said 50% would be substantial heterogeneity, something you need to deal with, with a p-value at 0.1, like the WHO's, because it's not a very sensitive test. So you need a slightly inflated p-value. When you can see, here's just some examples of, I have for harm, neutral, or benefit using cohorts and trials, but you can see here, this is of sugar-sweetened beverages and diabetes, where, you see this estimate, which has been quite reproduced across cohorts, but it's got a lot of heterogeneity. And part of that, we argue, might be because you're using prevalent, change for change, lag change, you're using different ways of modeling the exposure, and the combining of those may be contributing to that. Neutral, so this is a case where it's a neutral study. It was refined grains and diabetes, but you have high heterogeneity, some showing associations, some showing benefits, some showing harm, and some in between. And then an example actually of one of our own where we had very high in LDL cholesterol, and it may have been how we were weighting the crossover studies in this, but which was a lesson learned, but we had high heterogeneity. So just a few examples, something we need to deal with and something that needs to be investigated. Nearly all meta-analyses, which is good news, do investigate heterogeneity. So you can't leave it unattended like a kid in the candy store. You need to deal with it and not try to explain it and understand it. And most systematic reviews do that, which is great. And this is one example here where this is a BMJ paper we published on low glycemic index load. Laura Cavaroli, a postdoc of mine, now in junior faculty, we published this in BMJ. And we looked for A1C with glycemic index and load in trials in people with diabetes. We showed this reduction, which would be a meaningful reduction of 0.3 at the lower limit of efficacy for drug development. But there was some heterogeneity and inconsistency in the estimate. We found it was completely explained by a single study. And when it was removed, the estimate itself, the magnitude direction, the significance didn't change. So we were able to say we could explain the heterogeneity. We also saw a dose response, because often with when there's a good dose response gradient, that could be another reason for your heterogeneity. So we had good reason to explain it, so we didn't need to downgrade the data for it. Another one that I find interesting and more closer, probably a lot of Alice's interest as it relates to fatty acids. So this was Chris Ramsden did this meta-analysis. In the end, he got a lot of flack for his work on the Sydney Diet Heart and the Minnesota coronary, not I think for the work, but the interpretation. But one thing I found interesting, and this is one of those examples of, you can see the heterogeneity is pretty clear. When he did this comparison subgroup by looking at LA, so PUFAs, this is reducing saturated fat using different polyunsaturates. When he looked at linoleic acid versus mixed N3, N6, this is N6, so like a corn oil versus the others, you saw the benefit with the mixed oils, which would be canola and soybean, for cardiovascular mortality. You didn't see it for the LA. Likely this is not an LA story, this is an oxidized fat story because of what they were how they gave the corn oil in those two studies. But it does show you, it was a nice example of explaining the heterogeneity, and you can see it completely cleaned up. It was like 0% in the mixed group, where probably it was just the oils and level of oxidation was less, and you saw that benefit when they were substituted, and that was trial level data. Imprecision. So there's different ways to approach imprecision. One is just, does it have wide confidence intervals that contain both harm and benefit? Let's say in the case of a neutral finding, so it's hard to make a conclusion, it's imprecision. Another could be using minimally important differences, and we've taken this approach. It's also a good way to assess the magnitude of the effect association, so we pre-specify those. And so here's 3 examples. So here's one where it was cohort fruit juice and diabetes, the Imamura BMJ. So you're seeing this 10% increase in risk. There could be some misclassification issues here too because of 100% fruit juice and fruit drinks and other things that are part of this. But you can see that the confidence interval contains very low estimate, and we had said like less than 5% is trivial. That's what we pre-specify now. Or really probably not an important increase in risk. So this, even though it's not super wide confidence intervals, you would rate that it would be imprecise for harm. We can't rule out trivial effects because of the lower bound of the confidence interval. Here's one with Lee Hooper did with omega-3s in cancer. And her conclusion, and I think, in applying our MID criteria, it's very similar. It's like, even though it's neutral, and this is a case too, to be careful, oftentimes you do look at the analysis, oh, it's neutral, I don't have to think about it anymore. But do the confidence intervals, do they still contain harm, like meaningful harm or meaningful benefit? And this is a case of confidence intervals containing both. So we really don't know. The best estimate is it's probably close to neutral, but it still contains harm up to 1.3 or benefit down to 0.88. So this is a very imprecise estimate. This is where we do need more work. We need to understand and improve the precision of this estimate, omega-3s in cancer. And then a last one here, which was low GI and HbA1c and diabetes, similar one I had shown you. So this is one here where the minimally important difference specified by the FDA for meaningful difference in A1C is 0.3. So the mean estimate is 0.3. So we think it certainly, in terms of the mean estimate and reduction, would be meaningful, but the confidence intervals include very, very small effects on A1C. So this would be a case where, and we downgraded this evidence for that. We downgraded it for imprecision, not wide confidence intervals, but we can't say with confidence that the true estimate may not be trivial, so you downgrade it for imprecision. So those are a few examples there. Poor modeling of dose-response relationships. So here we, and this, again, our systematic review of prospective cohorts that we did with Dena, we identified that even though, there are cases where clearly, and I think this is the case based on using GRADE or others, we need to look at dose response. It would be informative. Only half presented a dose response meta-analysis. So it's something where it's been neglected in a lot of meta-analyses. And 2/3 the readers did not conduct dose response, among which this decision was only justified in only a quarter of them. So in most cases, it wasn't even justified. So I think it's important it's an important omission in a lot of them, in understanding it. The other issue with dose response, I know Alice is working on the DRIs, is this idea that every relationship is linear, and trying to fit a linear model to every exposure outcome relationship or intervention. And we know from nutrition is that, we tend to see actually, certainly with nutrients, is U-shaped relations. So we see, looking at the DRI model here, at levels where people are deplete in a nutrient, you have deficiencies, so you have risk. If now you see that being higher, then you have this Goldilocks zone where people are replete, and then you have toxicity. So the relationships are not linear. Now it depends where you measure the exposure. Like if you're just in here, then it's linear, and you're just in here, it's kind of linear, or maybe here. So it depends what your exposure range is. But across the full exposure range, you would expect to see some non-linear relations. And this is something we found, and this is work a postdoc of mine, Tosif Khan, did, looking at a particular 100% fruit juice, because there's a lot of misclassification, fruit drinks, and a lot of people say, fruit juice is sugar-sweetened beverages, but, they do contain nutrients at small levels. You might expect to see some benefit, and then where you consume more and calories become an issue, you'd expect to see harm. You would expect to see this U-shape. So with sugar-sweetened beverages, you do see this across the range of exposure, very linear relationship. But when you look at fruit juice, this is with CBD, you actually see this curvilinear relationship where it's really only at high intakes, and this would be out, this is not, this is like maybe this sort of where you're seeing protection is really like half a, 150 mils. So this is a very small amount. That would be the level obtainable from a piece of fruit, a fruit and a half. You are seeing benefit, but when you go higher, you see the increased risk. And you see that reflected here when you try to combine these two, where that signals the case. But really making the argument, and we made the argument in this paper, that we need to be thinking about these relationships as nonlinear and not just always trying to fit a linear relationship. So we found this is work Gila did, and we published in JAMA Network Open as it relates to food sources of sugars and metabolic syndrome. You see this sort of nice, very linear dose response with sugar-sweetened beverages. But with 100% fruit juice, truly, it's actually curvilinear. So at low levels of intake, only 100 mils. So this is like a half a cup, you're seeing maybe benefit. And once you get out past a cup, then you see increased risk. So it's a curvilinear relationship. Here's one, we see the same thing with hypertension. And just to, 100% fruit juice is actually part of the DASH diet, the NHLBI DASH diet. And this shows you at low levels of intake, I think, again, at the level obtainable from fruit, so small amounts, you see benefit. But when you overconsume it, which is our current environment, where you see very large portions in the fruit drinks, then you see the harm. So just to make the point about curvilinear. And then this one last example I thought was a good one, because there was this idea that carbohydrate had this linear relationship with cardiovascular mortality coming out of the pure cohort. And this meta-analysis kind of showed when they fitted it with ERIC data, they didn't have that full range of exposure. They didn't have the low end. And when you actually do the meta-analysis, the evidence, you actually see a U-shaped relation. So there is this Goldilocks zone, which fits very nicely with our ADMEs for distributions for macronutrients. Between here, but kind of between 40 and 55 is probably pretty good. But then once you get out beyond that, you see increased risk, or below that with low carb diets, you see this. So it's really kind of reinforcing what we see, but you need to have that full range of exposure, and you need to think about nonlinear relationships. Nature of the intervention. This is an important one, and we recognize this early for fatty acids. You can't just talk about all fat. It's about the types of fat and the food sources of fat. And this is just to show you with the paper by Mensick-Catan, an old paper, but I think it bears resurfacing and talking a bit about. You see the serum lipids depends on the food source. So when you're looking at good sources of polyunsaturated fatty acids, like rapeseed oil, soybean, even with monounsaturated with the olive oil, some of the mayonnaise, you see reductions compared to the average US fat this is the ratio of total HDL. But then if you look at those sources of saturated fat, like palm, shortening, butter, then you see an increase in that ratio. So that really, it depends on the source, and we're not talking about all fats. The same thing, here's one on whole grains, where, looking at whole grains and LDL, the whole grains that have health claims for reducing LDL would be like oats and barley, because they tend beta-glucan in the United States and Canada. And this actually shows that, like, if you're looking at it, which is very good, it's all whole grains are good, for reasons beyond LDL. But when you're talking about LDL, if you look at mixed versus wheat versus others, you're really not seeing an effect. All of the benefit in this analysis, so if you just interpret the summary estimate, you'd say, oh, whole grains lower LDL. Well, no, all of that benefit, like 50%, more than 50% of the benefit, the weight for benefit, is coming from oats. And if you added barley to it, where we have health claims. So just to say, you have to really think about what we're talking about. You need to give it a lot of thought about your intervention. Are we talking about whole grains or specific whole grains? And having that granular thinking, I think, to try to understand it. Another one where we've shown that is we've done these series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses of food sources of sugars, from diabetes through to cardiovascular disease. We published quite a few of these. I don't have time to go through them all, so I created this heat map for it, looking across these really big patient-important, public health important outcomes. This is the epidemiology. The darker the red, the larger the effect estimates for risk. The darker the green for lower risk. If it's significant, I put an asterisk. But what you can see here is the association with harm really is for sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit drinks. This is a really consistent signal across all these really major clinical and public health outcomes. Fruit drinks, mixed fruit drinks a little bit, but then 100% fruit juice, you see mixed signals and some benefit, especially the lower range. Fruit, universally good. Whole grain cereals, yogurt, ice cream has this interesting signal. You could, you could say it's like yogurt without the culture, a sweetened yogurt. Yeah, and then you see things like chocolate, which always comes out looking pretty good, dark chocolate. Just to show you the food source does matter. If we're talking about all sources of added and free sugars, we may be missing, the major driver here, where sugar sweetened beverages, and our guidelines reflect that, really are the main signal, and these other food sources may not be contributing a lot of harm, and they may be contributing benefit in terms of the nutrients they bring, like fruit or whole grain cereal that has a bit of sugar in it, or a yogurt that's sweetened, for example. We did the same thing for trials. We looked at 4 models controlling for energy, and then we looked at the interaction within those for food source. We had substitution, addition, subtraction, libidum, all based on calories. So substitutions equal swap, calorie for calorie matching, sugar for usually a starchy comparator, addition where it's adding excess calories compared to the control without, subtraction where it's removing those calories using water or low calorie sweeteners, and ad libidum, which is free intake. What you can see here, which we'd seen before, which is really the addition trials drive it, but when you do the interaction by where it's providing excess calories, by food source, you start to see even in some of the substitution trials, there is still some signals with body weight for harm, like with added sugars or mixed sources, sugar sweetened beverages. But sugar sweetened beverages is the main, and it's where it provides excess calories, and we see the benefit when you subtract them from the diet. But you also see benefit of things like fruit, 100% fruit juice, dried fruit, even honey and dark chocolate. So these are some cases where we start, so the food matrix does matter, and we've seen similar papers looking at sources of saturated fat and others, where we have to think about the whole matrix as well when we're thinking about how we deliver these guidelines. Importance of the comparator, this is a big one, and I wanted to use an example that I started off with as it relates to low-calorie sweeteners. So this was a literature where there'd been actually a lot of commentaries, a lot of letters, editorials in relation to this, really calling for really addressing the importance of the comparator and how that really been neglected. The issue with sweeteners is you can compare it to water or a placebo where they were tested for safety, and you're not displacing any calories. You wouldn't reasonably expect to see any change in energy intake or weight because you're not displacing anything. It's a matched control. The better would be to have a positive, if you like, comparator, a positive control, which is the intended substitution, which is a sugar-sweet beverage displacing those calories. So really the need to take this lens to the research questions. And we argued that this was part of the issue with the WHO. They actually did 2 systematic reviews commission. They did one in 2019, and then they republished one in 2022, where they'd reached out to us and we had shared our approach, and they did look at actually what the comparator was, and they did find reductions when you looked at the comparator, but they had this issue with the still with the reverse causality issue and mitigating that, and not looking at substitutions like they did for saturated fat, for example, with these big outcomes in the cohorts. So we designed our systematic reviews for the update of our ESD guidelines. We just published these in June. We had commissioned systematic reviews for these. And so we had the advantage of being able to design these commissioned reviews to specifically address this issue of the nature of the comparator. So in trials, we did this. We published this last year in JAMA Network Open, which was looking at using network meta-analyses. Don't have time to really get into it, but it leverages the indirect comparisons. It has direct and indirect comparisons with a common comparator to increase the information size. That was the first thing. And to look at 3 substitutions of clinical and public health importance, to really frame the question in terms of the comparator. So low, no calorie sweetened beverages for sugar sweetened beverages, which is the intended substitution with energy displacement. Water for sugar sweetened beverages, which is our standard of care. All our guidelines, we say drink water with energy displacement. And then the comparison of low and no calorie with water to understand, the reference substitution. How does that compare to that standard of care? To really get at this question in a way that could be useful. So we looked at intended substitution. We looked at 20 different outcomes that had been pre-specified. Everything was pre-specified by the guidelines committee. We did see the expected reductions in body weight, adiposity, and related risk factors, and liver fat, and no real concerning signals for harm. Everything generally showing a benefit, and these significant, more meaningful benefits for adiposity-related outcomes. We looked at the standard of care water. Interestingly, we didn't find anything significant, and we went to BMJ first time. The editors they thought that was conspicuous. We took all the literature. I think this was an issue where we had a lot of indirect comparisons, and there was some coherence issues, but In general, as a standard, it's still the standard of care, and everything was generally going the right direction. And importantly, then, when we compared the two, we found was they basically looked the same. So there was some cases that low and no calorie did a little bit better for body weight or systolic, and the water did a little bit better for A1C. It's not to say that either showed harm, it's just that one did a little better than the other. In general, no differences. So really the importance of looking at the comparator. We took the same lens to the cohorts, and we did this in a way to really address this issue of reverse causality by looking at the substitution and looking at change for the reasons I stated before in that other example as better ways to model the exposure outcome relationship. So we pre-specified that to mitigate that, and there had to be adjustment for adiposity. So those were kind of the three approaches we took to try to mitigate this signal that keeps coming up of reverse causality that's well described. So we look at the intended substitution. So instead of seeing increased risk, increased body weight, increased risk for obesity, increased risk for coronary heart disease, diabetes, and so on, we actually saw no harm or benefits. We saw reduced weight, reduced obesity, reduced CHD incidence, and reduced associated CV mortality and total mortality, which are big outcomes. When we look at the standard of care, we saw what you'd expect to see there, that when you're replacing sugar-sweetened beverages, you do see improvements in body weight, waist, body fat, obesity incidence, type 2 diabetes incidence. And we compare the two, no differences. So this gives us confidence that maybe it probably is a reverse causality signal. We now have agreement between the cohorts and trials, which is all what we're striving for. So the intermediate outcomes are agreeing now with those big patient-important outcomes in the epidemiology. And the change for change, also we saw the same direction of benefit. So it was able to overcome the reverse causality by the modeling, these modeling approaches. And our conclusion, 2023, is very much consistent with what I showed you, that American Heart, the other diabetes associations, others, that we recommended that they can be used, but we ensured we put the replacement in, which was sugars in beverages and foods, because I think that's really how we designed the question. What is the substitution? We just did a comment, a perspective is just coming out where we put all of these different ways of modeling the data, prevalent change substitution in a single plot, so you can see it. So the change substitution, you see benefit, where you model as prevalent, you don't, you tend to see harm, just to make that point in response to the WHO. And this is the example now showing you the data from Russ and what was done with the others, showing you if you model the substitutions, you see benefit. The last thing, publication bias. So the good news is the majority of meta-analyses do test for small study effects. The issue is most don't deal with it. And so it's important, this is to give you an example from the Memora paper. They did find, this is low and no calorie sweetened beverages again and diabetes, this increased signal, but there was publication bias. And when you adjusted for it, you actually lost the association. And another way to think about it, and this is just a thought, we didn't do it, but another way to understand it, understand whether, if we have lots and lots of cohorts, and very few are actually identified in this analysis. Another way of looking at publication bias or exploring understanding it is the number that have the exposure and have the outcome but haven't published. So we have the ones in dark blue that were part of the meta-analyses, but there's a number of others that we're aware of that certainly can measure the exposure and the outcome that haven't reported, and how that might be able to help us understand that publication bias, not just doing the imputations, but actually sort of calling out the need for more research. Takeaway messages: systematic reviews and meta-analyses provide a reproducible set of methods for summarizing the best available evidence on a given nutrition question, but are not a black box. To conduct meaningful, impactful, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, a multidisciplinary team, and I think part of this is having the expertise in your team where that relates to a specific nutrition domain, which allows you to get at the nature of the intervention of the comparator, health research methods and research methods in terms of your approach and looking at designs, biostatistics in terms of statistical approach, information sciences for selecting the studies, and knowledge translation for actually making sure you get the question framed in a way that can be used by users and decision makers is important. There are a number of things that you need to include to make it really have a robust evaluation. And that does not end just with, again, the black box, direction, significance of the pooled estimates and the diamond. It's really like you need to interrogate the data and interpret it, looking at levels of evidence, risk of bias, all the things that basically we talked about. And if one accounts for these, I think, and I think every systematic review every systematic review and meta-analysis should be able to provide an assessment of certainty of evidence, which I think is important and incumbent on those doing the work. And to allow then for the appropriate inferences that can guide clinical practice, you can then use that by applying a framework, a system, like grade or Nutrigrade or others. I think the important thing is to specify it, that it's rigorous, transparent, reproducible, like systematic reviews methods themselves, so you can get at that answer. So I just want to thank my research group and this wonderful opportunity to come and speak with you, and I look forward to any questions in the brief amount of time we have. Sorry for running out.
Well, when I introduced John, I used a lot of accolades, and I think now you probably understand why I did. And he has really exceeded expectations as far as this presentation. So thank you very much. The Friedman School thanks you very much to give you this. And if you are willing to take some questions,
Yes,
then I would invite people to step up. And I'll actually start off because one of the issues is that, as you pointed out, the WHO tends to be a little off relative to all the other bodies. And one of the most recent things they came out with is to maintain the recommendation of less than 30% of energy as fat, whereas in 2000, dietary guidelines changed it, the American Heart Association, the NSEP federal. What do you think is going on with the WHO?
Yeah, this is a great question. And one thing I keep coming back to when I've had those discussions with other colleagues is they're probably actually underfunded for this. And they just don't have the systematic review meta-analysis. They do have the expertise, like the methodological expertise, and a lot of times is there. And they do have a very good new guide committee, and a lot of whom are known to a lot of us, and good scientists there. And I think it's just a matter of not having the funding to be able to come back to these questions. Like it took them 10 years almost to come back to the saturated fat question. And I'm sure it'll take them 10 more to redo their analyses and discover that the 30% doesn't make sense, or the low calorie sweeteners. So it's really an issue of funding. The other issue that they've had, despite the new gag, I think, having expertise, I don't know how broad it always is, that committee. And a lot of those things we realized, like the first one on low calorie sweeteners, it was like there was clearly, and there was none named in the byline with the authors, any nutrition expert there. They hadn't thought about comparator. They hadn't thought about matrix, and it didn't make sense. You had the top level methodologists. Like I was trained by Jörg Meerpol. He's a great expert. He knows great, but he doesn't, nutrition. He's on the new gag. He's learning more and more. But that need to really make sure that you have, I think, importantly, domain experts as part of putting that data together and the interpretation of it. It's not just the methodologists that are just going to pump out that diamond and say yes or no. It's like, now we need the interpretation.
And just to reinforce that, when the Evidence-Based Practice Center was at Tufts University, I certainly wasn't a methodologist, but I was the domain expert for nutrition, and we ended up doing a lot of reviews with a nutrition-related topic. Other thoughts, questions? I know there's been a tremendous amount of information.
Yeah, it really goes back, I was going to say, to like that PICO, how you ask, what's the population or patient group? What's the intervention? And how are you framing that? What's the comparator? How are you framing that? What's the outcomes? And you need the domain experts to really help with that, even just starting with the question, making sure you get the question right.
And sometimes you hear the term TEP, Technical Expert Panel, that you then want to go broader. Questions? Yes. Okay, Dr. Rogers.
Speaking as a non-biological scientist, I'm an economist. The hierarchy of evidence that you're talking about, one of the things that I sort of felt I learned when I came here and we were working with the HNRCA is the importance of what's the underlying biological mechanism that makes the associations plausible in that sense. So we observe and we do randomized controlled trials and so on and so forth. But at some point, what's the role of saying this is the biological causal pathway?
I mean, that goes back to Bradford Hill criteria. That's one of the absolute criteria. I think that that's essential before even starting it. That rationale has to be there. And one example we have, I would love to put lots more examples, but Andrea did a Nature Medicine commentary on the burden of proof series of studies in Nature Medicine, and they've got these really inflated uncertainty intervals. And one of the examples, I think, and it goes to biological plausibility, is they got the same rating for smoking and ischemic heart disease as they did for smoking and lower back pain. Well, smoking and ischemic heart disease is well established, Surgeon General, it's causal. We have 6 mechanisms that can explain that. We don't have any mechanism to explain smoking and lower back pain. It may well be related. I mean, smoking does everything bad, we know. But the point is they're coming with the same level of evidence. Just even thinking about the biological pathways behind it, I think should have given pause when they were doing the validation of the burden of proof approach to assessing uncertainty intervals that there's a issue, there's a mismatch here. There's an issue. How can we be rating this evidence as the same when there, we have no biological basis for it? So I think it's an important one.
I can actually just give an example of biological plausibility and where it doesn't always work. So it turns out with vitamin E, there were two observational studies, 1995, in the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, there was an inverse relationship. So individuals who took vitamin E supplements at lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So what's the biological plausibility? Well, antioxidant, and if you take oxidized LDL in tissue culture, the cells will take it up more readily than the non-oxidized LDL. If you gave people vitamin E and you isolated their LDL, it would be more resistant to oxidation. However, with all the randomized controlled trials, they were negative. So there was the biological plausibility, but the issue is there were redundant antioxidant systems within an intact organism. So you really need a combination.
And the ability of antioxidants to become pro-oxidants depending on how you consume them. And this was the same with beta carotene. And we had a lot of biological mechanisms why it would be protective against cancer. And then you do the big trials, 29,000 smokers, and it ends up killing more people. Back to the drawing board because so you may have good biological rationale for it, but that's why you need, I think, all these levels of evidence to inform your decision making. It's not enough just to have one. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well then I'll just bring up one more thing because you did, and that was PICO, and I'm not sure that everyone in this room understands that everything starts with the question. So do you want to just sort of explain
when we're designing our systematic reviews and meta-analyses, maybe I should have put it there, but that's something that's definitely not reported. So it's hard to say whether people do it or not, but it should start with a question, and it's not just, if I consume more of this, does that increase my risk for heart disease? It has to be framed in a way that you can then translate from it. So we call it PICO, which is population or the patient group, depending on what you're looking at. I is for intervention or exposure, if you're looking at epidemiology. C is for comparator. O is for outcome. And then, having a hierarchy of outcomes, I think, is important, like big clinical outcomes versus intermediate ones like LDL. And then you can have an S or a T for study design or T for temporality. So you can really drill down in terms of being very specific. And so you can be specific then in your conclusions, and that will form your entry criteria for your meta-analysis. In many ways, the same way you design a trial, that's, you're going to use that to design your trial. Like, is it in people with diabetes or not? What's my intervention? What's my comparator? So it's applying that same lens when you're asking a question in this taking this epidemiological approach of systematic reviews meta-analyses. So it starts with a PICO question or PICO question.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, once again, I'd really like to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This has been outstanding.
Thank you.